like to invite up the first speaker of the following discussion.
The stigma that we hold against hypocrisy only prevents our society from progressing healthily and harms people on a personal level in like all situations where this hypocrisy applies. Four things in the speech. Firstly, on setup. Secondly, how we get less fixed opinions. Thirdly, how we get a better understanding of human flaws. And then finally, how we get healthier criticism. Luca will do an extension for his substantive contribution. So firstly, on setup, what is this hypocrisy? It's just like engaging in behavior that you've previously shunned. So this looks like a parent telling their kids not to drink, even though like they probably drink in their free time. Or secondly, it looks like shunning behavior that you've previously engaged in. This is just like the reverse situation of that. So what is the world that NEG supports? So they support this stigma, this immediate recognition that somebody has contradicted themselves, and they use that contradiction to firstly like shun them, to tell them that that's not okay, they can't do that, to put like this huge stigma against them as a society. Or secondly, they disvalue their opinion. They say that because they contradicted themselves, they can't be very smart, their opinion can't be accurate. So this looks like public criticism of a politician who is advocating for a policy that they previously disagreed with. That is the world that NEG supports. So what is the world we support? We support firstly criticism still existing, right? You still have the ability to call out people, it's just not based on this hypocrisy, right? So you can still call out a politician if they like break the law, because obviously that's really wrong. There is still accountability there. Secondly, we break down the idea that people are obliged to stand for what they've done in the past. Like, people evaluate things as they are in the present in front of them as they see them. So two ways we can win the debate. Firstly, we enable a more progressive and dynamic society, or secondly, we get more empathy on expression of opinions. So firstly, how we get less fixed opinions. So what happens when you're called out for hypocrisy? Firstly, it undermines your credibility. People see you do it, they think that you must be wrong a lot of the time because you were wrong once. Secondly, you're likely to get a lot of hate because it is a societal stigma. Thirdly, you lose faith in what you're trying to achieve, right? Because you lose that accountability, that credibility. Fourthly, it can spark personal conflicts. So generally people want to be avoiding these things, obviously, because that's quite harmful to you on a personal level. How do people think then? Firstly, they feel obliged to stand with their original opinions and actions. This looks like a politician who voted against something in their past is now obliged to stick with it in the present so that they don't appear as unprofessional for contradicting themselves. In our world, there is no attachment to existing beliefs or past actions. This means that they have flexibility in their opinions and can actually express what they believe is their true values and something they genuinely support. Secondly, they don't want to be seen as unintelligent, right? They don't want to be seen like on a societal stage as being wrong. They don't want that attention. In our world, people are able to learn from their mistakes without any judgment and without this like attack. Thirdly, they don't want backlash from the media, right? They want this media is hugely incentivized by profits, so they want a juicy story. When you have this societal stigma of hypocrisy, that means people immediately buy into this stigma. They immediately think, ooh, this is a really juicy story, there's some hot goss. So this makes hypocrisy a really easy target, and it tarnishes these people's reputation. In our world, people don't have to fear that media backlash because it is accepted that they can make mistakes. Fourthly, they don't want to lose their jobs, right? They're likely in an important role, and their job could be on the line if they're hugely attacked for making some hypocritical mistake. So, for example, someone in the CCP wanting to make liberal changes within the party is going to be losing their job because it's not something that they've supported in the past. They're being hypocritical. They can't do that. This means China doesn't develop and people in that country don't get rights. What does this mean for us? Firstly, people aren't scared to express that they've changed their minds. This looks like having open-mindedness and more new opinions as a society as a whole. On a political level, this looks like politicians now voting in favor of their actual present beliefs and their core values. This means that on a party level, they're able to adjust to changes in the world quicker. This means that we get more minorities being seen because we are developing and these people are becoming more regular and are requiring different needs all the time. So secondly, on how we get a better understanding of human flaws. Why are people hypocritical? Firstly, they've obviously made past mistakes that they now realize are wrong. Secondly, it's likely an impulsive decision that doesn't actually align with their actual beliefs. Thirdly, it can come from deeper issues. So we think that it can look like a parent who has genuine an alcohol addiction or some sort of substance abuse, trying to tell their kid not to get into that, trying to preach that they shouldn't do that. This is hypocritical, but they're just trying to protect them. So what does this stigma make people think? Firstly, it's just that humans should be perfect, right? You have to stick to your values. You can never contradict yourself. You can never make a mistake because that goes against what you believe as a person. There's all of this pressure that you can never get anything wrong. You can never have this human mistake, this human error that always exists. In our world, people don't feel ashamed of their mistakes regardless of their values. They have the ability to not only make that mistake and express it in the first place, but also to seek help if that mistake actually harmed them, and also to preach to others not to make that mistake as well because they don't have that societal stigma hurting them. Secondly, they're seen as intentionally deceptive, right? They're contradicting themselves. A kid looking at that parent saying, "Oh, don't drink alcohol." They see the parent as being contradictory and therefore don't take it seriously because it's well, why are you telling me this? You're just a hypocrite. You do it, so it can't be that bad.
On that point.
So what does this mean? In F's world, people, A, don't understand the flaws of making mistakes, they don't understand this human error, and B, they're very likely to be criticizing them for it on a human level, on a personal level. This looks like parents always having to appear as perfect, otherwise all of their discussion is belittled and their opinion doesn't matter. This looks like a single mum who is trying to preach all of these good beliefs to their child about just being friendly to people when maybe they have been rude to someone and therefore the kid thinks they can be rude to people as well. This is way too much pressure to apply to that single mum who already has all of these things going on in their life. This leads to stigmatizing the things that actually lead to that hypocrisy in the first place. This means things firstly, mental health is hugely stigmatized because it's a mistake that you've made in your past and is now being criticized for. Secondly, things like addictions are hugely stigmatized. People can't seek help now because it's seen as societally wrong. Thirdly, people I'll take a POI real quick.
Due to the nature of campaigns and elections, do you not think it's important that a politician upholds the policies they campaigned on?
Not necessarily. So I think it's really important to note that the world is changing as a whole. Parties need to be flexible to adjust to things that are changing in society and changing in day-to-day life. They need to be making changes. They need to be able to do that without being attacked on a personal level. So I'll just continue on. Thirdly, people acting on emotions is seen as really frowned on. So the impact is firstly on an individual scale, you feel trapped, you feel you can never make mistakes, and when you do, you feel ashamed for them because you are going to make mistakes, you are going to be hypocritical because it is human nature to be making mistakes. On our side, people are able to be open, they can get help. This means their self-esteem is better, they feel proud of their mistakes, they feel proud to voice them. Secondly, this extends into interactions. People now understand that everyone has human flaws, everyone is gonna make mistakes, so they treat everyone with empathy. This means there's less conflict because people understand this is really important for people's well-being and for how we function as a society. So quickly on how we get healthier criticism. So hypocrisy is inherently focused on the individual, right? Because it links into their past, what they've said, what they've done. So it's not focused on the issue or situation, it's only about the person. We told you that humans are going to be making these mistakes. So when this happens, criticism is only aimed at the points themselves, and the media is very exploitative of what that means. This means that firstly, we get better quality dialogue. Secondly, we get more educated people on policy because the media is going to be more focused on the policies. And then thirdly, we get a better democratic system because people are more informed. Proud to affirm.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his speech. I'd like to invite the first speaker of the meeting.
hypocrisy is lying. It enables you to say one thing, act one way, and believe an entirely different way. This is the mechanism by which corporations and politicians lie to our faces and do the exact opposite. It erodes trust in democracy, it erodes faith, it erodes accountability, and without hypocrisy, we can never have a clean, open, honest discourse. Side neg is proud to negate. What do I have for you in today's speech? I've got 2 points. Firstly, how not stigmatizing hypocrisy enables deceit and it enables deception. And in my second point, I'm going to be talking about how only by calling out this hypocrisy and stigmatizing it can we actually have accountability and open discourse. Okay, so now moving on to some setup and then some rebuttal. Firstly, we just see that hypocrisy is a form of lying. We think it looks like saying that you have one value set and then acting a different way. We'd just like to note here, this entirely contradicts the definition that we heard coming out of side F. It is not that you previously held a belief and you changed it. It is when you currently say that I, in this moment, hold this belief and then you act another way. It is saying, it is like, we don't think that you can, like we think you can completely have a belief at 16 and change it when you're 30. We think it's not enough though for a 30-year-old to be saying, I am not a sexist person and then being in a violently misogynistic friend group, right? We don't think that's acceptable. Okay, we'd also like to note in our setup that we think hypocrisy is inherently bad. You are lying, it is eroding faith, it is eroding trust. We think just by having the action of hypocrisy in our society, it is a harm. So now moving on to more rebuttal. Firstly, we've got this point that hypocrisy is, like I've touched on this before, which is that hypocrisy is actions that you're currently doing. We disagree. We think that, like, you can change your values, you can change your beliefs. We think that's perfectly acceptable. We think it's if you're currently like having a belief that you contravene, that is when it's hypocrisy. Now, you talked about how the only way you'd ever be calling out politicians is like when they're committing crimes. We think that's actually absolutely terrible. We think on our side of the house is that when Christopher Luxon stands up here and says, I support mental health, then removes the mental health office and slashes a quarter of their budget, we should be calling him out. On their side of the house, they stood up here and said, we stand politicians lying. We are disgusted by that. And now, the next one is that just engaging with their material about how they said, like, one mistake will, like, we don't want people to be called out when they are being hypocritical. We completely disagree. We think that if I'm a person who preaches women's rights, then I'm in a misogynistic friend group. Someone should be coming up to me and saying, hey, you're being hypocritical. Have a long, hard look at yourself. We think that is an incredibly important mechanism. We think that calling someone out for their hypocrisy is the only way to ensure accountability in your life. Now, this now leads me on to my first point, is how not stigmatizing hypocrisy enables deceit, it enables deception. So, the context is that hypocrisy is a form of deception. You either do or encourage an action that you would otherwise not do. Hypocrisy builds up trust in a group or in individuals as you falsely represent values you do not hold. This looks like preaching a value set without doing it. That is inherently bad. You have a justification for the value set. Your justification of the value set is inherently flawed, as you either cannot or do not want to hold it. Thus, it is in bad faith to preach about it. It is to another group an inherent harm, as what you're telling them is going to fail if you don't hold those own beliefs. Now, I'd like to note now that when we have hypocrisy, this inherently erodes accountability and it erodes trust, and we think that's a massive harm when you're just when you will happily lie to someone, and we don't think that you think to yourself, hey, that's a moral issue and it's so destigmatized in your society. Now, we think this exists on a sliding scale that I'm going to talk about. This exists just on like a friend group level, where you have a friend who has assaulted someone, and we think this extends all the way up to politicians and to corporations. So, onto this example of a friend who has assaulted someone. This looks like a 16 or 17-year-old boy who tells his girlfriend he respects women. He's in a violently misogynistic friend group. What happens to this girlfriend, right? In a world where you do not stigmatize hypocrisy, what can she say? Like, hey, you say you respect women, but you're hanging out with a bunch of misogynists. What's up with that? Fix yourself, right? We don't think that's a mechanism which she can actually call out. We don't think she has the capacity to say, hey, what's up with that? That only exists in our side of the house when we can call people out on, actually being hypocritical. What's the impacting of this point? Why is that so powerful? One, for the boy himself, if he actually holds those beliefs and he's just losing himself on a slippery slope, that's the only way, being called out on that hypocrisy is the only way he's ever going to be able to reform his behavior. You have to say, that's not good enough, or how will he ever know that? Only when we actually call him out with having stigmatization of hypocrisy do we get that. But now, what's the even more powerful mechanism? It's for that girl herself, right? She has a sexist boyfriend. She can't say, hey, I don't feel comfortable or safe with the people you're hanging out with, because otherwise, because he says he's not a sexist person, without stigmatizing this hypocrisy, why would she ever be able to speak out, right? We think this extends to the fact that it erodes promises and erodes trust in a relationship. We think that's incredibly harmful. What does this now look like when you bring it to a corporate scale? You may have noticed that BP released a campaign where they'd help you calculate what your carbon footprint is. BP has a greater carbon footprint than New Zealand. It doesn't matter how many EVs I buy, it's never going to make a difference. But what BP is doing is they are using this hypocrisy to try shift the blame away from them onto the individual, onto the consumer. What's the harm of that? There is no accountability for BP. They're being hypocritical, they're shifting the blame, they're moving it away from them. And what we can no longer do is say, hey BP, you're literally just spilling oil into the oceans every 30 seconds. What's up with that, right? Like we say, you preach these values and you don't follow through. If we don't have a problem with accountability or with hypocrisy, how can we ever get that accountability, right? Only uniquely through the mechanism of stigmatizing hypocrisy can we say, you're not actually doing what you're saying you're doing. What's up with that? And then, let's have an investigation into that. We'd also like to note how that having this ability to call out BP is so much more important than any potential benefits of what BP tell us to do in lowering our carbon emissions. This corporation is worth millions and millions of people in terms of emissions. So just the value of their virtue signaling doesn't change. It's far more important to have social pressure on them to change. Now, moving on to the next point, which is politicians. What does this look like? The context is that Christopher Luxon campaigned on helping mental health, and then I told you he slashed 25% of the mental health budget. He removed the suicide prevention office. What's the problem here? Christopher Luxon is hypocritical. He is saying one thing and doing another. When we do not stigmatize hypocrisy, what is the impact here? Christopher Luxon can get away with all of this lying, and it's eroding trust in the government. Before I finish this point, I'll take a POI.
When Christopher Luxon slashed the mental health budget, he formed a policy that impacted a huge proportion of New Zealand. Therefore, why would people not have the ability to criticise that policy without the stigma of hypocrisy?
Because we think that we disagree with that. We think the context here is that he took, the money went into tax cuts for the 1%, and we think what actually happened is he's just lying about his policies in an effort to get votes. We think that's terrible. It is eroding trust. It is eroding faith in the government. We think democracy exists because we trust that our politicians do what they say, and when we don't have that, this looks like Donald Trump and his incessant lying leading to January 6th riots. We think that when we do not have this accountability, it massively harms our democracy. And how do you react to your politicians lying? You lose faith and the government loses its mandate. Now, moving on really quickly onto my last point, which is how calling out hypocrisy is a vital mechanism for accountability and honest communication. When you have a Christian who is violently homophobic and you say to him, hey, what's up? And he cites the Bible, but he also doesn't donate to charity. What's the actual thing here? Maybe it's just a bad person. Maybe he's just a bad person. But only when we actually can call him out in his hypocrisy and say, hey, the reason you're doing this isn't just because of the Bible. Maybe you're just a bad person. It's the only way we can strip away the lies and the deceit and get to an honest discourse about why people actually do something. This is incredibly important in the debate because if we ever want to get to the root issues that they seem to care about, we need to be able to say, hey, what do you actually care about? We think that only ever happens when you call people out on their lies, when you prioritize truth. That only ever happens on side neg. We proudly are against lying. We are proud to negate. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his speech. I'd like to invite the second speaker of the affirmative.
We all have values, as human beings. But when you create this idea that if someone does not follow those values in every action that they take in their lives, if someone is unable to make mistakes, if someone is unable to do things that don't follow those values and then learn from them, what you do is you put shame on those people for just being human. You shame human nature, and that is the greatest harm that negating brings to you in this debate. I have 3 points to touch on in this speech. Firstly, a point of clash on getting a better, more progressive and accountable society. Secondly, on better acknowledgement of human flaw. And then thirdly, I'm going to do an extension on how we get healthier criticism on our side of the house. So firstly, I just want to talk like a clarification on like what this hypocrisy actually looks like. What we hear from negating is that like, oh, it's okay to like change your values and beliefs, and the hypocrisy, like, by definition, is only about, like, when you contradict your present and your current values. So I just want to point out that, like, yes, while this might be, like, what hypocrisy is, like, defined to be, that, like, when the debate is not about hypocrisy. The debate is about the stigma surrounding hypocrisy, right? What this means is that, like, for someone to enact that stigma, it's how somebody else perceives you as being hypocritical, rather than whether you are actually, by definition, being hypocritical or not, right? So why is this different? Because, like, often when this looks like you criticizing a politician, you don't know that politician personally. You, like, can only know them based on the actions that they have done. So if they have voted on a policy, if they have made a speech on a policy a few years ago, and all of a sudden now they're contradicting it, yes, people are going to, like, stand up and go, you're being hypocritical, even if, like, they have changed their minds. We think this still exists on their side of the house, and we think this is still very harmful, right? So with that clarification out of the way, the other thing I want to point out is just to like remind you of what we told you in our setup, in that there are still many other accountability mechanisms. We are not just removing criticism as a whole. We are only removing one way of criticizing, right? Like, you can obviously still criticize policy that you disagree with. We still have accountability in that way. There is still the democratic system where you can vote out people. Like, that's like how our democracy works. You can vote in the parties that you want. There's still press. Press can still like talk about bad policies, talk about bad behavior that is happening. And there's still freedom of speech. On the individual scale, people can still like post on social media, people can still protest if they think like bad things are happening. So they tell us that like Christopher Luxon is able to like preach mental health and then stand up and like slash the mental health services. They never told us why that criticism and that accountability that they get is unique to their side. Why can we still do that on our side, and why is it actually better? Because we tell you that people are still able to criticize Christopher Luxon for slashing the mental health office, right? But we tell you that like we actually get better discourse on our side of the house when that happens. Because on their side, it is like the easiest course of action for an individual to criticize Christopher Luxon is to jump straight into a personal attack. To say, you said you were trying to support mental health and now you're not. Like, ultimately that's not really that productive. You're just attacking the person. And like what can we do on our side is that you criticize the action that has been taken, right? What this means is that you're able to discuss why the thing is needed in the first place. So instead of like, because it's like a slightly higher bar to criticize somebody, to criticize a policy. Like, it takes slightly more intellectual thought than just the brain dead, like, oh, you said this, now you do this, right? Like, it means that you then go through and you like actually be a debater and you explain the mechanisms at play. You explain like why that thing is needed in the first place. Like, why do we need support for mental health? Why do we need money? Where does that money actually go to? How does that then lead up to impacting people? How does it make people's lives better, right? Because we tell you that these people are still going to be angry when like Christopher Luxon cuts mental health, even when like there's not this idea of he's like contradicting himself. So then what happens is the discourse, the pushback that happens, like the people protesting against that slashing of the mental health services is actually better because it's more focused on why that mental health services were needed in the first place, which means you're actually more likely to then get reform. The like opposition is more likely to push back harder. The opposition is more likely to understand that it's an issue people care about and then come in and like change that policy. Or if you put enough pressure on the government, they will undo the reforms that they made in the first place. We actually get that happening. Like, you saw when there was a lot of pushback about this idea that Christopher Luxon removed the suicide prevention office, they instantly turned around and said, oh, actually, no, we don't want to remove it. Like, that's still happening, right? Ollie told you then, what do we get on our side? Ollie told you why people are scared of contradicting themselves in the status quo. What this means is, on an individual level, people continue to engage in discourse about their existing beliefs. They feel a bit ashamed of admitting that they are wrong or admitting that their friends have a point, right? What this means is when you are discussing politics, right, people like are likely to just stick to what they believe, and then that translates to what they vote for, because it's like, oh, that's the discussions that they've been having. On our side, people are more open-minded, more likely to admit that they were wrong, more likely to change their minds, and then you get more liberal voting. You get like a voting that's more representative of society. We then also told you at Ollie how like you get a more progressive change, you're more likely to get politicians like changing to the times, and then that means you get quicker and better like rights for minority groups who like now all of a sudden society accepts. I'll take a PY before I move on.
What a 16-year-old boy who claims to be a feminist, yet hangs out with sexist friends, being called out on his hypocritical actions.
That's exactly what I'm just about to talk about. So now we'll get on to the point of clash and how we get better acknowledgement of human flaw. They tell us about people who are being friends with those that contradict their beliefs, like those teenage boys, right? I want to note here that stigma is what's changing on the side of the house, not that like we just don't have hypocritical actions in the first place, right? It's whether or not they're stigmatized. Why are people unlikely to just drop their friends, like if all of a sudden like they're being told that they're misogynistic? Because it's hard to make more friends, because sometimes these friends are like come from long ties, like you've known them for a long time, because it's more complicated than just like they were wrong. Maybe they like have it's like more nuanced. It's not that black and white. But for because like people just want to fit in, they're not just going to drop their friends. So what happens on their side is not that the guy drops their friends because their girlfriend is like criticizing him for it. It means that the guy never tells his girlfriend about that friend, and it means that the guy never talks about that misogynistic language in the first place, right? What this means is that he's more likely to internalize that because he's not talking to another perspective about it, because his girlfriend is unable to challenge some of those beliefs, because he's just keeping it a secret, because he doesn't want his girlfriend to know. He doesn't want to be called out for that hypocrisy, right? On our side, because there's no stigma, he does talk to his girlfriend about that, because he's just more open about it, right? That means the girlfriend is able to challenge that and then able to change the beliefs. That means that guy can then go into that friend group and is more likely to challenge his friends and trying to change their behavior. You actually get like a more progressive and like more productive change in that case, right? We told you why humans are inherently flawed, right? Just because people have important roles in societies doesn't make them suddenly divinely perfect. They still can suffer from mental health issues. They still have emotions that can lead them to do hypocritical actions, right? What this means is when you create this idea that people are lying if they don't always follow their beliefs, it means that you like create this like idea of perfection that just ultimately doesn't exist. Ollie told you why that's really bad on a personal level, because you end up shaming people, and that's like really bad for their mental health. They feel like there are standards that they're never going to meet. Their self-esteem gets worse. But then also on an interpersonal level, you're more likely to have empathy for people who are in different situations when you understand that they are flawed individuals rather than like people who should just like always follow what they say. Okay. And now onto my substantive contribution, how we get healthier criticism. The context is that hypocrisy is inherently focused on the individual. It links to their past, what they've said, what they've done. It's not focused on the issue or the situation. And like we told you that humans are inherently flawed, so it's not actually helpful to criticize individuals, right? When this happens, what happens? Firstly, criticism is aimed at the points themselves. When we like get rid of this hypocrisy, this is what I told you about Christopher Luxon. Instead of just pointing out the hypocrisy to invalidate the individual, you then like focus on like actually criticizing the point and the stance. And this means that secondly, the media is less dramatic and exploitative. Articles aren't just attacking that person for their past, but the articles are more focused on the dialogue and actual viable criticism, which then spreads to readers, and that's what they believe. What does this mean? Firstly, you get better quality debate. It's focused on the facts and the discussion. You get a more educated society. But secondly, you get a better democratic system, because on their side, people's news feeds are just about personal attacks, and that's what they base their voting beliefs on. You create a politics that is focused on personality rather than on the issues. On our side, like we're actually able to have a good democracy because politics is focused on the issue rather than the person. And that's what's most important.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his speech. I'd like to invite the second speaker for the negation.
hypocrisy is not just shunning behavior you used to do. It's preaching as if you have authority on a topic while refusing to or being unable to uphold that view yourself and in your personal life. It is campaigning on health but shutting down smoke-free legislation and then saying, times have changed, it's all good, sorry guys, right? To use the affirmative example, we reject the notion that it's hypocrisy for a parent in active addiction to warn their child against alcohol, right? It would be hypocrisy, however, for that parent to blame that child if they ended up with the same addiction for the same reasons that the parent did, and we would reprimand that behavior because if you know yourself how inescapable addiction is and how hard it's been for you to stop your own addiction, you shouldn't preach to others or your children about personal responsibility and not be held accountable for how that makes your child feel. Warning others of what hurt you isn't hypocrisy, but telling others that they should get out of that same hurt in a way that you know didn't work for you is bad faith. It's not something we can accept, right? I'm going to talk about three things in this speech. Firstly, on hypocritical actors and why they act the way they do. Secondly, on mistakes and accountability. And thirdly, on trust, right? So firstly, on these actors. Now, even if you don't believe all of our material about how hypocrisy causes more hurt in the world, I'm going to quickly talk about why it's still a correlative relationship between hurt and the amount of hypocrisy that a politician, a corporation, or an individual has. There is a strong correlative relationship with the level of hypocrisy someone has and the amount of good, the amount of bad they do for society, or how little good they do. So even if you don't believe that the act of hypocrisy is inherently bad, the actors who showcase that trait usually come with other harms. And so this argument is that stigmatizing hypocrisy is just also a very efficient way to weed out ineffectual politicians, bad faith corporations, and toxic boyfriends. So why do people act hypocritically? Two reasons. Firstly, that their capacity was never aligned with what they promised, or that their capacity ceases to be aligned with what they promised, right? So that looks like the sexist boyfriend, that looks like the national government. So note that this is the most likely case of why people are hypocritical. It's not always malicious, but it is really prevalent, and we think it needs to be stigmatized and needs to be called out like we do on our side. We support punishing the hypocrisy of actors, if only as a way to weed out those that have limited capacity, right? We would, even if you don't believe that hypocrisy is inherently bad, if a politician is hypocritical, it means that they promised something that society thought was good, they then got into government, and then they didn't have the capacity to do it, meaning they're not a very effective politician, right? So that harm scales all the way from not hiring a manager at a company who says in their interview that they're very into punctuality and will be really hard on the employees about that. But then with their reference from their last job, they had several late clock-ins, right? It's not only bad that they had these late clock-ins, it's an extra harm to commit these acts if you're simultaneously preaching about law and order, right? It's not just bad they were late, it's bad that they then preached about the importance of being on time to employees under their control, because it says something else about that person's trustworthiness and entitlement. But even higher stakes is when a politician knows they do not have economic capacity to make beneficiaries more accountable by hiring thousands more social workers like National campaigned on, right? But they campaigned on that still because they knew it would get them the votes of those who resent beneficiaries, even though they knew they didn't have the capacity to match that. Which means that we end up under their side with destigmatized hypocrisy, leading to governments being able to use the defense that the affirmative uses, which is times change, I didn't really know what I was saying, right? It's a hard time for everyone. So we can't support that. We think that politicians and individuals alike should be held accountable for what they preach versus what they practice. Before I move on to mistakes, I'll take your point.
A toxic boyfriend who is now fearing the stigma that they may face is more incentivized to stay quiet and stay in the relationship than speak out and be open about the toxic traits they may have. How do you expect to get that with the stigma?
I think that girlfriends are always going to find out about their boyfriend's toxic actions. I think that it happens regardless. But so that would be symmetric, right? But even if it was that this boyfriend was hiding something, right? We explained to you that there's a different harm on your side of the house that's equal of her finding out about it but not being able to call out her boyfriend because he says, I said this one thing, but it's really nuanced, and my friends, they're just uneducated, right? So on that, let's talk about mistakes and accountability. We think criticizing mistakes is important. We reject what the affirmative team posits when they say that people are human and that, it's all right if a politician messes up and votes for the wrong thing. We think that yes, mistakes are human, but when we're talking about intentional deceit, like we are in this debate, and when we're talking about people with very, very important jobs who affect millions of people around the world, then we should be criticizing mistakes whenever they come out. So on their point about how they still have this ability to hold people to account, right? We explain that it's not just bad that governments enact harmful policies, right? There is an additional harm to the voter in terms of how much they trust their government and in terms of how much society can function to not practice what you've been preaching on. Because when you vote in a government, you're expecting them to do what they said they would, and it's additional harm to your trust in that system when you don't end up with what you wanted. Especially if you were a middle voter who was choosing between two parties, one of which who might not have been hypocritical, right? That's the big harm that we're talking about in terms of like accountability and holding politicians to account, right? Because when you can't use that weapon of you said this, you didn't do this, this has made me distrust you. When you destigmatize hypocrisy and all you can say is, I didn't like that you got rid of smoke-free legislation. When you can't say, you said one thing and you said the other, right? Like, regardless of if it's like trivial, like how they posit it, that's a really good way to hold a politician to account. We can't support getting rid of it. It looks, after capacity, it's this thing of malicious intent, right? Like, often politicians do have malicious intent when they campaign on policies like that, right? It looks like, using false support for a group to then later hurt them when you get in. It looks like Trump campaigning on immigration to appeal to Hispanic and black voters in border states and later causing immense racially motivated harm to these groups. It's not just bad that racially motivated harm occurred. It's bad that people originally believed it wouldn't because they trusted this person who's in a really big position of power. Raising expectations and then slamming down on them creates a worldwide impact of emotional harm because humans are relative beings. So if you raise people's expectations and then don't live up to what you said you'd do, that is immensely worse on their side of the house when we can't say that hypocrisy is a bad thing, right? But finally, on trust. The backbone of society is the trust that you have in the people around you. It is the trust you have in your boyfriend not to laugh at sexist jokes. It's the trust you have in the government to enact policies. It is the trust you have in corporations it is the trust you have in corporations not to put blame on you for the oil spills in the Pacific Ocean, right? Hypocrisy harms the amount of trust, the amount of overall trust in society more than a bad action by itself, right? It uniquely builds up an individual or a group's trust in one another. It could be trust in their values, it could be trust in their authority, trust in their advice. We don't think it is good faith to preach to a group of people as if you have complete authority in the subject and then be so entitled that you don't follow that yourself. It looks like the church preaching about how homosexuality is a sin, but letting it go when a priest is committing acts of pedophilia, right? It looks like the church picking and choosing which parts of the Bible to preach about when it suits them, and under their side, you don't get to use the weapon of hypocrisy is bad to call them out on that, right? When we say we stigmatize hypocrisy, we are challenging the value sets that people use as justification for their actions. Because necessarily when you say you have a value set, but do something else, that is not okay.
I'd like to thank the speaker for her speech. I'd like to invite up the third speaker to the affirmative.
We have laid out to you multiple tangible reasons why this has the stigma around hypocrisy has super negative effects on individual people, as well as how it affects politicians. And it simply doesn't outweigh the marginal benefits that we've heard from the negating team on why the stigma is effective. So a few things in this debate. First, I'm just going to, two primary points of clash. First, we have the effect that this will have on politicians and the criticism on them, and also the effects it'll have on their chance of being re-elected. And then second, we have the individual effects it has on a personal level, okay? And then, so those are 2 points of clash I'll be covering in this debate. So the first point of clash that I want to go over is this,
like very contentious point about like how this is actually going to affect politicians. And I think what is incredibly important to note before getting into this is that the negating side's definition of hypocrisy and how the stigma around it will be enacted simply isn't accurate. And what does this mean? Well, as my second speaker told you, it is unrealistic to expect the public and media to actually follow hypocrisy like to the letter on the definition and like fairly dish it out as criticism to people. So what does this mean? Like if you think about media, for example, it's much more sensationalized. So the idea that people will only look at what they've done now and be super fair about whether something's hypocritical simply isn't realistic. This applies to the media in cases of politicians, but even on a smaller scale to like how individuals view stigma, even if it's like in a social context and people they know and how they're being hypocritical. So this is incredibly important because it means that like unlike what they said, past actions are incredibly likely to be used as an example of like hypocrisy. And as you'll see, this is incredibly important into predominantly how like politicians react to this. Okay, so the first thing that I'll cover under this point of clash is that we were told that like they aren't really going to be criticized for hypocrisy if it happens. Okay, why is this simply like not true? Okay, well we told you that one, if they are doing something that is genuinely bad, and this applies to corporations as well, so for example your point about BP and how they're polluting the environment, if they're doing something genuinely bad, we've proven to you why they are still going to be held accountable for that. Even if it's not hypocrisy, they're still doing something that harms people, and so this is going to obviously come with backlash, okay? And so like even with politicians, right, how is this actually going to look like in terms of punishing them for these negative actions? We can hold them accountable through things like obviously them just being voted out because it's democracy, media backlash, which is going to have like effect on them. So like obviously, for example, the Smoke Free New Zealand example that you used had massive negative backlash for them. And then third, also just like social media and protests, you're going to have a general societal movement against these people. So that shows why if they're doing something bad, they're still going to be held accountable for it. But secondly, we on this point of clash is that we've shown you why if you get rid of this stigma, you're actually going to get more political reform and more progressive politicians. And this matters a lot because it means that we can have like actual new political reforms and policy changes because people are changing their mind, which outweighs like any individual actions you could hold against one politician. Maybe you can say that one politician lied about a policy or said that they didn't mean it. All that means is that they can't enact this new policy, or maybe they'll undo the cut that they just made. But what we've proven to you and what went completely unresponded to is the fact that they had that now that the stigma is gone, politicians don't feel pressured by their past actions, which are going to be held against them if they change their mind, meaning that they can actually make like beneficial policy changes that are just better for society. And it shows like how society will now be more progressive and dynamic because people are willing and able to like make these changes. So note that went unresponded to. We've proven to you why there are now going to be more progressive and dynamic politicians in their beliefs, okay? Another important thing to talk about is just the idea that, thirdly on this point of clash, that politicians aren't effective if they don't fulfill this promise. And why is this just simply not a realistic assertion from the other team? Okay, what is important to note is that political parties cannot realistically be expected to fulfill every single promise that they like make during a campaign. So especially if you think about in the context of a coalition government like we have now, it's not realistic to hold the one figurehead or member of a party accountable because they weren't able to fulfill these promises and say that they're not actually a really capable politician when there are multiple other factors like being in a coalition government and also having resource constraints that stop them from enacting these policies. So clearly that's not an effective line of thinking. And what this leads to is that like when you do stigmatize politicians not being able to enact all their policies, people always are going to think that the government's incompetent, right? They're going to think, okay, well, you didn't enact all your policies because the standard's been set that because they've told the public that they're going to enact these things, they weren't actually able to do it, they must not be very capable. People are always going to be unhappy with the government, even if the government is actually just acting like in their best interest, trying their best, but there are resource constraints or just like restraints from those coalitions. And so this means that people just kind of disengage with politics because they don't see the government as an actual effective body, and they feel like the system's always bad. It also means that like secondly, you normalize politicians being called out for hypocrisy like all the time because clearly this is something like expecting politicians to always be able to make these policy changes isn't realistic. People are always going to be calling out hypocrisy. And what this leads to is that it creates a generally negative characterization of the government, which means that when a politician does something seriously wrong, like they're breaking the law or just like other bad policy, people aren't going to be that engaged with it because we've proven to you why they're disengaging. But also secondly, they're actually like it's not going to be dealt with in a serious enough manner because there's just this general perception and desensitization to politicians like doing bad things. I will now take a POI.
Do you think hypocrisy still exists under your side of the house?
Well, okay, one, we've shown that like even if people are still acting hypocritical, we get better tangible outcomes like the policy changes I mentioned before because the stigma is removed. So even if you aren't holding that one politician accountable, you're still getting better like policy changes overall. And second, I think a lot of what that kind of is insinuating will be addressed in this next point of clash. So now I'm going to move on to the second point of clash, which is the individual effects and how this affects people just like on an individual level, okay? So the first thing I want to talk about is this like sexist boyfriend example, which I think applies to a lot of just like less hyper serious but still like put in common like social examples of this happening. So we already told you that like because the stigma exists, this boyfriend's not really gonna want to talk about it or engage and like risk changing his mind because he wants to stay with his friends. But what I think is like really, I'm frankly weak from the negating side, is that the only reason we were told that their like example of the girlfriend being able to change her boyfriend's mind still exists is because the girlfriend's just going to find out eventually. The bottom line is that the girlfriend isn't part of the friend group, and when these conversations are happening online, you can't realistically assert that in all these situations the girlfriend's just going to find out about the sexist friend group. So this shows that when people are in situations like this with toxic friend groups that have negative traits, they're actually not going to want to like engage or share it because there's a stigma around it. This leads to them being in like an echo chamber and not actually having the chance to, you know, learn about different ideas. Meanwhile, when the stigma is removed and they talk about it, one, if you do want to call them out, still being around like sexist people or actually being sexist yourself is a bad thing. So this isn't ruled out from being something they can be called out about. But also, like it shows, it can lead this person, this dude, the boyfriend in this situation, think that, okay, I can change my mind. It's not going to be held against me for the rest of life. And so I think we've comprehensively proven why in these social situations, you actually get like more buy-in and positive chances for change. Meanwhile, if there's a stigma, people are just going to stay the same. They'll stay in their echo chambers. To continue on to my second kind of section of that individual and social effects clash, we were told by the negating side that like in the case of an addiction, it won't be considered hypocrisy. It won't be part of the stigma. What I think is important to note is that if we think back to when I told you and explained to you how the public won't use it strictly to the definition, the bottom line is we can't realistically expect like friends and family to just ignore the fact that someone's doing drugs or addicted to something while telling people not to do it. So I think that even if like you can't follow it to the definition, and this means that they are going to be shunned, they're still going to not really seek out help, and so all our negative effects that still affect addicts and people like and like even just parents in general who are going against what they teach their kids, like all these negative things still happen. They feel invalid, they don't want to get help, and this just has a negative mental health effect on this. Also, please do quickly note that our entire point about why we get healthier dialogue, because you have to take points themselves instead of the speaker, went completely unresponded to. So our points still stand about how we get better quality media and a more effective democracy because this dialogue is healthier. Proud to negate.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his speech. I'd invite up the third speaker of the negating.
Sorry, I have like 1 million pieces of paper. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Rishi Sunak's hypocrisy, knowing he couldn't stop small boat immigration, is the reason he is calling an election before that becomes apparent. Because Sunak, like us, knows that the British public doesn't like hypocrisy and they're human and don't like their trust being broken, which shows that challenging hypocrisy is a very important mechanism in the people to actually create change, especially political change, which we think is massively important in this debate. 3 clashes for you here. First on accountability, then on like criticism. First on criticism and like human flaws, second on accountability, and third on like trust and overall outcomes there. So to start on criticism, I'm quickly going to clarify something, which is that the affirming team has come out and basically said that like when we stigmatize hypocrisy, humans cannot have flaws, humans cannot make mistakes. We think that this is not true. The reason we think this is not true is because when a human makes a mistake and someone calls them out and say, hey, that's actually directly hypocritical in relation to something else you said, they're thinking, oh, I made a mistake. I should change that, right? It's actually a direct mechanism to help them change that mistake and help their views get better, right? We think that that's always going to be better, and we think that that's actually not going. The only difference is that on our side, they're being called out immediately and can consider their opinions and change their opinions and have better opinions there that don't hypocrite themselves. What we think actually changes is the people who are being hypocritical intentionally in a way to deceive people, right? So essentially, to start on this point of criticism, the affirming team has basically told us that people can criticize otherwise, and quickly, just to respond to this directly, we think that every single mechanism they've given us for other ways that people can criticize can still work on our side, right? We think that people still do protest on our side. We think that people still do call up, hey, I think that mental health is really important and I'm mad at this specific policy, right? We think that that's not something that changes. What we think changes on our side is they can also actually directly say, hey, you are being hypocritical. You told us when I voted for you that you were going to do one thing and now you're doing another. And we think that that is fundamentally so important to democracy, right? Democracy, we don't think it's actually okay for a politician to get into office on a view and then oops, I've actually decided to change that view. Coincidentally, well, I now have the power to change everything in this country. Lol, people are different, right? We don't think that's ever okay, and we think that our leaders should stand for what they ran for. We actually, again, I've mentioned this before, so I'm just going to say this really quickly. We don't think that this is something that's going to be, David Seymour said something 5 years ago, and now he's saying something different today, and so I'm going to beat him up about it, because we think that politicians who do that can say, hey, I thought this 5 years ago, but I think something different today. Here's the reasons why I think that. We think that politicians don't just assert things, and if we do, we think that we absolutely should be calling them out and saying, hey, you said that 5 years ago. We think we should be encouraging that discourse where they say, actually, yes, I did say that 5 years ago. Here's why I think differently today. We think that is always beneficial to the political system, and so we don't actually think here that within politicians and especially within corporations as well, which has kind of fallen out a little bit, but in the BP example, we think that we should actually always be criticizing them. We think that that is always going to be helpful, right? And we think that that always enables people to change their opinions, or if they're not willing to change their opinions and actually are, we think, being dishonest on purpose, it allows people to say, hey, that's not okay, right? And we think that that's always really important. The affirming team have also basically tried to say that, people will just be scared, so won't say anything. Like I said at first when I started this speech, we think that actually people will say anything because they know that they can be challenged in a healthy way. That it can be, hey, you actually said this other thing the other day, and now you're saying this other thing. We don't think that's okay. And we think that's always going to be good. And we think that when people are scared and they don't say anything, that's not any different on their side of the house, right? We think that the difference between being scared and not saying anything and not doing anything because you're not held accountable doesn't change at all. So we don't really see why that matters so much to them. So at the end of the day, what we're getting here is we're getting human flaws are still allowed, but the people who are bad faith actors and who are trying to harm people are held accountable, and that's especially important in our political system. So now on to accountability, right? I'll take a POI real quick.
As an everyday voter, it's realistic that you might not feel confident engaging in complex discourse about an issue and instead default to personal attacks on hypocrisy. We also told you why media has an incentive to focus on these personal aspects. Why then do you think that people are more likely to engage in this healthy criticism about the issue than attack the person for their hypocrisy?
Interestingly, we actually think that it's okay to attack the person for hypocrisy. We think we absolutely should be. We think if the Prime Minister is doing something that directly contradicts what he ran on, we should be going, hey, Prime Minister, that was your responsibility and now you're doing that. And we think that that enables those people to get better, and that actually it is important to hold people accountable, not just hold policies accountable. We think that the more accountability you can get, the better. And that's what we get on our side, right? So, like I've said, on this accountability point, we think that all the other ways to be accountable still stand on our side. We just think that there's ways to personally hold people accountable. And we think that personally holding people accountable, like I've just stated, is actually really good, right? What we think happens on their side is they actually lose a really large way to be accountable, right? We think that that's always harmful, especially when we're in a democratic country or a system where it's necessary, or where we're trying to hold a corporation accountable. When Starbucks says, hey, stop using plastic straws, but are actually one of the biggest polluters in the world, we should say, hey, that's actually not okay, and you shouldn't be shifting that blame. We think that is always something that is actually going to be good. We also think that this uniquely allows us to get to the behind meaning, behind why someone or a group is actually being dishonest. For example, the Christianity example that we gave us. If someone is saying we don't like gay people because it's in the Bible, but are actually having premarital sex, you can say, okay, well clearly it's not the Bible that changes all your views. So there's something further behind that. And we think it's really important that on our side, and uniquely on our side, we're able to get to the behind bit of that views, right? So we're getting more understanding of these meanings, and we're getting more accountability, and we think that accountability is always good. Now, thirdly, on trust and these outcomes. So I've mentioned a little bit before, they've said oh, people will just hide for. First of all, we don't think it's fair to say people can just hide and no one will know. Shh, right? But we think when people do just hide and no one knows, shh, that's the same on their side. So we don't actually see any change there, right? Sorry. But what we think happens when they can't hide, right, is that now there is a direct mechanism to help them change, and we do actually think that is absolutely worth it. We also think it's important to mention in the boyfriend-girlfriend example that for a lot of these people, the harm is not on the boyfriend who still has bad friends. The harm is on the girlfriend who has had the additional harm of being directly dishonest and feeling lied to because her boyfriend has said, yes, slay women queen, and he's actually going around with a guy who has an assault allegation, right? We think there's that additional harm there that the other team is not accounting for. And so it's not actually about will the boyfriend change, it's about will the girlfriend be able to stand up and understand this, and there's that additional harm on the girlfriend, right? Secondly, on the government, we think that people having trust in the government is so important, and they've basically told us as well, real quick, that they believe that okay, a politician does a couple things wrong and now they think they're stupid. We think it's really good that if our politicians do a lot of things wrong, we think they're stupid and we don't want them. We want the best politics we can get. We want the best democracy we can get. And so what we get here is we get a bit of democracy, we get a democracy we trust, and we get people that we trust and people who are held accountable. Thank you very much.
Thank the speaker for his speech. As is tradition, we'll now flip speaking orders, and I'll invite up negating for the leadership line.
It's not enough for the affirmative team to come up here and argue that people do bad things anyway, that that situations are nuanced and people's relationships shouldn't be tied to their past behaviors. It's not enough for them to justify hypocrisy by saying it's just about how the times are a-changin', right? I'm going to talk about two things in this reply. Firstly, why people should be held accountable to their words when they're then acting, right? And secondly, what happens when they don't. So firstly, on these hypocritical individuals, right? So we think that people, especially people in positions of authority, and note that these are really important actors in this debate because they affect everyone who lies underneath their authority, and often these are politicians or leaders of corporations who are very influential in the world, right? So we think that these people should be expected how to act, how they tell others to, or how they say, they calculate values based on, right? They should do what they promise in their policy outline when they're campaigning, right? Because necessarily that's what people vote on, and it's actually not very good if people vote on that and then that never ends up happening, and now someone's vote is wasted, right? We tell you this at second and third. We say that they should do what they preach so much about, and that looks like both, preaching about how important race relations are to them, and it also looks like preaching about how you specifically should care about a specific thing, but then not caring about it yourself, right? And like we think that they should be expected to act like this for two reasons, which we used in second and third to respond to Af's material on mistakes, right? So firstly, it's a form of dishonesty, and specifically it's a form of dishonesty that uniquely erodes your relationship with others, right? Because it's the one way that humans use to build up someone's trust and then immediately break it down in a really personal way. We tell you it's not just a mistake that's like human nature to be hypocritical. It's a really calculated thing that people do to enact changes that benefit them and only them, or to build up someone's trust in a way that benefits them and only them, like in the politician example, like in the toxic boyfriend example, right? It's a strategic thing. It's not just something that we do by accident, right? And because it's this form of dishonesty that erodes your relationships with others, we think that there's a massive harm in this debate, and we should be like trying to eradicate hypocrisy as much as we can, which is why we think that destigmatizing it is completely going backwards, right? But the second reason why we think that they should act like this is because it sets an example for society, right? Like, we talk so much about these personal relationship examples that probably aren't as impactful, but they do get influenced, as we explained to you at second. The societal idea of trust needs to be upheld by everyone in order for our society to function properly, and therefore we think it's really important. But secondly, if they are being hypocritical, right, and they're doing things that the public or the people around them don't agree with, why do we think we get better behavioral change on our side of the house? So we note to you at first and second that instead of challenging actions, we on our side have the unique ability to challenge people's internal justifications, which are the root of all the problems we're talking about in this debate. If hypocrisy isn't an issue to you on their side of the house, it's unclear how they identify that someone's being dishonest about their views and values if they can't challenge these internal contradictions in behavior and words or preachings and practices, right? As we give to you at our first point at first, right? Like when the church says that their internal justification is the Holy Bible, and then they go against that, only under our side can you use that as a mechanism to challenge the harmful things that they do, right? And it's when they don't practice what they preach that you get all of these emotional, political, and economic outcomes that we talk to you about down the line, right? We give you this analysis on how when you trust someone who is now turning their back on you or what you believed in, you feel cheated, you feel hurt, you feel angry. This has the ability to affect billions of people in the debate due to political hypocrisy, personal relationship hypocrisy, and corporations, right? We tell you that then flows on politically and economically when it's these people in positions of power, and we tell you that in no world can we accept the destigmatization of the thing that creates that.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his speech. I'll invite up the affirming for the leadership.
The world is not black and white. It is dynamic, it is changing. People have many flaws, many incentives that lead them to the actions that they commit. Hypocrisy is often unintentional. But when you create a stigma that makes people unable to see this nuance, you shame human beings for their very nature. You make politics about catfights on personality, not the issues that actually plague a country, and you prevent progressive reform. How do we win this debate? We told you that if we get firstly a society that's more progressive and stable, or secondly, more empathy and a better understanding of human nature. Let's start by taking negating at their best. Let's believe that stigmatizing hypocrisy does facilitate healthy accountability and a reduction in bad, corrupt politicians. Why do we still win? Because we told you that we get better empathy and better understanding of inherent human flaw. We told you that the stigma of hypocrisy creates impossible and unrealistic standards on individuals to never act against their values, even when, like, mental health problems exist, addiction exists, just simply having emotions exist that cause you to act in ways that might be against your own self-interest, and that this creates, like, these incredibly harmful standards. I want to flag that this had no response till third neg, which, like, we then weren't able to further respond to, like, but even that response that they did give us on, like, oh, it now provides the people a chance to change change those like harmful behaviors is still like ultimately dismissive of the reality that like we told you that people do want to follow their values. It's not that they don't want to, but their human nature is preventing them from doing so. It was insufficient then. What do we tell you that this leads to? Firstly, that everyone in society feels like they're not good enough. They feel ashamed for behavior that is natural. This is degrading to their self-esteem. It means they're less likely to talk about these flaws that they're having. It means they're less likely to open up about these problems because they see it as a skill issue rather than just a normal part of life, right? But secondly, people don't have empathy for others. Like we told you that the root of conflict is this lack of empathy, lack of understanding about human flaws. It's this belief that everyone is doing it just to be like intentionally deceptive. But then what we get on our side is we get an understanding that like hypocrisy does happen naturally. We get more unity in the human race, right? We tell you that like even if you believe the marginal benefits that they do bring us to politics, that they are only marginal because they conceded that like the stigma of hypocrisy was only one tool in like the toolkit that people have and that like other politicians have to like hold like corrupt people accountable, because they agreed with us that you can still like debate the policy, that you can still get angry when politicians put out bad things, right? So what this means is that if they get some marginal benefits to this policy that is happening, if you believe that that is the case, like you have to weigh all of this material that we bring you on like personal pressure and like more empathy over that, because that affects everyone compared to like only like one or two policies that are now getting made because of this slight increase in pressure. But why do they actually make politics worse too? Because firstly, we told you that accountability becomes focused on personal issues, that politics becomes focused on personality, right? Because we tell you that people get mad on both sides, people care, have reasons to care about policy on both sides, but on their side, right, they're more likely to like debate the person. They're more likely to say you were hypocritical because you said this and now you're doing this, right? We told you why that's actually unproductive, why that's like not really actually like creating any credibility for that person who's trying to hold those people accountable. On our side, when we remove this like easy entry-level way of holding politicians accountable, we force people to actually dig into the meat of the issue, which means that they're actually like taking that issue seriously. It means they're actually doing debating. It means they're mechanizing their points, right? What this means is that you're actually more likely to get reform because these people are pushing for things that are better. It means that the media is not focusing on these like easy clickbait articles about people. It is focusing on the real issues. It means you get a more educated society. We also told you why you also like just also broadly get politicians more likely to just implement policies that like then change with the times. They're more likely to like argue for things that go against what they believed in the past because they now believe that that is right, and that is really healthy for society. We get more progression and we help people.
I'd like to thank all the speakers for a wonderful debate. I'd invite you guys to walk up and then shake your hands.
Well done.
Good job.